Mass production rendered the end result of labor less tangible. In the past, man worked to produce the objects needed to sustain the bodily existence of oneself and the people around him. He worked to feed himself, to warm the house, to clothe himself against harsh conditions and the gaze of others. That changed with the rise of the industrial environment. He now worked to produce objects for people far away. The answer to the question of what is the meaning of one's work no longer welled up from one's own body. In addition, the other for whom the ones worked was anonymous. The effect of one's work on the other could no longer be seen or felt. With the disappearance of much of the local, small-scale, and craft production, the direct link between producer and consumer was broken. In most cases, the person who produced the material good no longer came into contact with the person who was about to use it. When a product was delivered, the person who produced it no longer witnessed the joy or gratitude on the recipient's face. It's these visible, subtle physical effects that primarily provide human satisfaction in work. They are the most direct sign that work is meaningful. In this way, not only one's own body, but also the other faded as sources of meaning-making. The worker became, as they say, a cog in the industrial machine, lubricated only by the thought of wages due. Labor changed from a cumbersome but inherently meaningful existential task into a disembodied utilitarian necessity. Besides waning meaning, another problem arose. Surprisingly, industrialization and the mechanization of labor didn't mean that less work needed to be done. In the early 20th century, British economist John Maynard Keynes predicted that by the end of the century, technological advances would translate to a 15-hour work week, which would be sufficient for society to produce everything it needed. He was correct on that last point. More than correct, in fact. It probably requires even fewer than 15 hours of labor for society to achieve that. But his prediction didn't come true. By the end of the 20th century, people worked longer hours than ever before. What Keynes failed to consider was the creation of meaningless and useless work on an incredible scale. Professor of anthropology David Graeber described this in his by now well-known book, Bullsht Jobs. He asked a random sample of people whether they thought their jobs made a meaningful contribution to society. About 37% answered with a definite no, and an additional 13% were unsure. These bullshit jobs were mostly created in the administrative and economic sectors, and the countless occupations that support these sectors. You'd think that in private companies, dominated by capitalist pursuits and dictated by profit, such absurd work wouldn't exist. Why would a for-profit company hemorrhage money on unprofitable workers? However, this idea can be relegated to the realm of illusions. Even in the private sector, there is a proliferation of meaningless work. We can attribute this, in the first place, to the changes in corporate culture. Today's executives rarely have a true personal stake in the success or failure of the company they lead. They can afford to create pointless jobs, perhaps to do friends a favor, or to give the company a sophisticated image by employing any manner of experts, if need be, even solely to optimize their employment statistics. By the time the company goes bust, the executive will have been employed elsewhere for a while anyway. But there's more to it than that. The rapid growth of the administrative and economic sectors has to do with much more fundamental psychological tendencies in our society. Endless proliferation of rules, procedures, and administration usually stems from interpersonal mistrust and inability to tolerate uncertainty and risk. Both the government and the population are ever more demanding that everything be done correctly. This involves endless procedural provisions, necessary to determine who is financially and legally liable if anything goes wrong. As we will discuss in Chapter 5, today's compulsion to regulate and control is a frenetic attempt to master ever-growing anxiety. If human relationships are characterized by fundamental distrust, life becomes hopelessly complicated, and society spends its energy at creating all kinds of security mechanisms, which, in fact, fuel mistrust even more and are, above all, psychologically exhausting. That's why the phenomenon of bullshit jobs is also directly associated with the epidemic of workplace burnout. What makes work performance unbearable is usually not the actual demands, but the impossibility of experiencing meaning and satisfaction, of experiencing work as an act of creation. Put someone in an office and pay him a generous wage to perform a useless task like pushing a button every 10 minutes. Does such a job free you from the burdens of life, or does it make your life unbearably light? In the end, a paradox arises: feelings of resentment and revenge toward those who have meaningful work. It's remarkable that it's mainly the people who perform work that is directly useful: healthcare workers, garbage collectors, craftsmen, farmers, who get fired or whose work is so poorly rewarded that they have to almost live on the breadline to survive from subsidies. Think of farmers who produce food, the most necessary material object of all. On the other hand, the most meaningless jobs, such as administrative work, are steadily increasing in number and are, in comparison, rewarded more and more generously. This is more or less the unconscious reasoning of, if you are lucky enough to have a meaningful job, you should not expect to be adequately rewarded on top of that. And just like that, we've ended up in a situation in which it almost seems foolish to choose meaningful work. The rise of meaningless professions shows us that the real problem of humanity lies in human relationships, more so than in the struggle with natural forces or in the physical demands of work. Simply put, in a society in which human relationships are satisfying, life will be bearable even if it has only primitive means of production. Whereas in a society where human relationships are impoverished and toxic, life will be difficult and unbearable, however advanced such society may be in terms of mechanical, technological evolutions.